You know what happened?
Plane crashed.
Where?
To the houses.
Disaster strikes again in a nation on alert, in a city on edge. A jetliner crashes on takeoff in New York. Investigators ask, was it an accident or an act of terror? They don't know. In the U.S.-led war overseas, United Front forces take still more Taliban territory. They are now within a few miles of the Afghan capital.
This is an expanded edition of the CBS Evening News, with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. It has been another tough, sad, unsettling day for the nation and New York City. The wounds inflicted by murderous hijackers still fresh. New York was shaken today by another air disaster. The cause of this one still not clear. Whatever you may have heard speculated, the fact is investigators do not know what caused this calamity. Here's what we do know. An American Airlines jetliner crashed this morning in a residential neighborhood in the New York City borough of Queens, setting houses on fire. The European-made Airbus 300 had just taken off from John F. Kennedy International Airport, carrying 255 people toward the Dominican Republic. Within seconds, something went terribly wrong. The plane broke apart and came down in the community of Belle Harbor on the Rockaway Peninsula just south of the airport. There were no survivors. We have extensive CBS News coverage tonight, beginning with correspondent Richard Schlesinger at the scene of the crash.
Just 2 months and 1 day after the World Trade Center attack, frighteningly familiar images flooded over New York City. A few minutes after 9 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 587 from New York to the Dominican Republic plunged in a fireball into a small residential community just miles from the airport, right in front of Gus Cholakis' house.
I looked out the window, I seen a big fireball right across the street from my house. It was amazing. And I came out, I ran out in my shorts, and then I looked and I seen all the bodies over here.
The plane crashed into a neighborhood of working-class houses, mostly along one block. But an engine fell several blocks away. Witnesses saw it drop from the plane.
It dropped, there was a flash, and the next thing I know, I saw the plane go down nose first, like at an angle.
How steep was the angle? Can you show me?
It was like this.
You saw like a cloud of smoke, you know, the cloud of smoke. And then from the cloud of smoke, it became a giant mushroom, like a nuclear bomb hit or something. It was like so huge.
255 people were aboard the Airbus A300. Nobody holds out much hope for survivors.
We just marked the bodies with sheets and blankets anyway. Any bodies that we found, we covered with sheets so that the police could take the bodies out, or we would bring the bodies out.
We're doing everything we can to recover as many of the bodies as possible.
There are still people missing on the ground. Firefighters say they are almost certain residents died in this neighborhood. 12 houses were hit by the plane. It's still very early in the investigation, and authorities have not determined a cause for this crash. Reportedly, there were no unusual communications from the plane. The plane's tail was found in the water near the crash site. Wreckage littered backyards and streets all over this area. Federal agents and police walked door to door, collecting evidence and talking to neighbors.
My husband saw the plane.
Across New York today, an already nervous city stepped up its alerts. Bridges and tunnels were closed for several hours. All 3 airports were also shut down while authorities tried to figure out if this was another terrorist attack. Everything has now returned to what passes for normal these days in this city.
And they've been recovering bodies all day here. So far, more than 200 have been taken out of this neighborhood, and they're still in there looking both for bodies and for clues, because investigators are still not certain if this was an accident or another attack. Dan?
Richard Schlesinger. As news of the air crash spread this morning, everyone asked the same question. Was it more terrorism or an accident? Correspondent Bob Orr in Washington covers aviation for CBS News and has the latest on the various theories, which is all anyone really has at the moment. Bob?
Dan, investigators frankly are stunned by what they found at the crash scene.
Parts of American Airlines Flight 587 have been scattered over a much wider area than they first thought, raising now the possibility of a large in-flight explosion that may have resulted from an engine problem or something more sinister. Late today, salvage crews pulled a large, nearly intact section of the jet's tail from Jamaica Bay, several blocks away from the main crash crater. That is strong evidence that the Airbus A300 began breaking up before the jet hit the ground. Veteran crash experts say it would likely take a sizable explosion to sever the tail. There is some evidence that one of the plane's engines did explode in flight, but investigators are at a loss to explain how that could have damaged the rear of the airplane. One source told CBS News, "It's bizarre. It is the last thing I would have expected." The Airbus A300 took off from New York's JFK Airport at 9:14:34, bound for the Dominican Republic. Something went wrong immediately because less than a minute and a half later, at 9:16:01, radar contact was lost. There were no distress calls from the pilots. The plane only reached 2,800 feet and a speed of 270 miles an hour before it apparently started coming apart as it plunged to the ground. While investigators are looking at the tail, they are also focusing on the plane's right engine, which also separated from the fuselage. This hole, clearly visible in one side, may be evidence that the engine blew apart in flight. That's an extremely rare failure, but when it happens, shrapnel can rupture fuel tanks, cut control lines, and render a plane uncontrollable. The engine in question, General Electric's CF6, is one of the most widely used in the world, but the CF6 is prone to developing small cracks in the engine hub. Left undetected and not repaired, those cracks can lead to catastrophic failures. The FAA has repeatedly ordered airlines to look for engine cracks, and American Airlines says the engines on Flight 587 were up to standard. But the right engine found near the main crash site was nearing a 10,000-hour overhaul.
The left engine had 694 hours since its last overhaul, and the right engine, the number 2 engine, had 9,788 hours since its last overhaul.
Late this afternoon, one of the plane's black boxes, believed to be the cockpit voice recorder, arrived in Washington and was taken to the NTSB's lab. Now experts are looking for evidence that will either rule in or out an engine failure or sabotage. It is important to remember that accidents often result from a string of failures. The question now for investigators is what happened first. It is possible, we have to say, that an engine failure could have ruptured a fuel tank, and that in turn may have fractured the fuselage. But investigators say it's also possible that something else, like an explosive, could have triggered the fatal scenario. Dan?
Bob Orr, our aviation correspondent. Could it have been a criminal act that brought down the plane? The FBI is looking into that angle of the investigation, and so is CBS News correspondent Jim Stewart.
For a few dizzying minutes, federal investigators thought the worst. They saw the same bright blue sunny sky over a plane crash in Queens that they had seen 2 months ago over lower Manhattan and wondered how in such weather can this be an accident. But so far, that's precisely how the FBI is treating it. Why? Because agents picked up no intelligence either before the crash or afterward indicating terrorism. There was no communication indicating a struggle aboard the plane. There is no evidence thus far of an explosive device on board, although forensic experts have just begun their work. Plus, there were no suspicious passengers on the manifest, and there is no evidence of any type as yet that sabotage was involved. Still, the FBI does not like coincidences and said it will interview airport personnel, family members, airline employees, and witnesses in the coming days, as well as monitor for any intelligence of terrorists taking credit for the crash.
An ATF bomb team is on the scene and is expected to start a more detailed search of the debris later, and federal investigators say nothing will be overlooked. That includes a claim by airport personnel of unusually heavy bird activity near the runways at the time of the crash, suggesting that some of them could have been sucked into the aircraft's engines and played a role in the crash. Dan?
Jim Stewart reporting live from Washington. We take you now back to the crash scene in what New Yorkers call the Rockaways. CBS's Lee Cowan reports the plane went down in a New York City community there that has had more than its share of pain and loss this year.
The Rockaways are the kind of place where residents can watch the sun rise over the ocean and the sun set behind the skyline of Manhattan. Today, it was under a cloud as black as September 11th.
The same blocks, that lost people 2 months ago are living on that street. So it's like it happens all over again.
All over again. On that day in September, this same community lost no fewer than 75 people in the World Trade Center. After today,
Plane crashed.
No one here believes that lightning doesn't strike twice.
I mean, people are just starting to get to sleep at night without jumping out of their skins, and now all of a sudden, we're dealing with this.
Gail Allen thought she'd seen it all.
Hard to believe it's not over, and it's not going to be over for a long time.
4 days ago, she held a memorial for her son Richie, a New York City firefighter in his first year on the force.
I mean, I don't think I've accepted that something happened 2 months ago. It's still hard to believe that even happened, let alone have something like this happen again. It just seems impossible to believe it can happen to the neighborhood again.
But this community, full of financiers and firefighters, doesn't go down with a whimper. Take John Moran, a battalion chief who died in the World Trade Center attacks. At a benefit concert in New York last month, his brother Mike made his hometown proud.
On behalf of my brother John and all the people from my neighborhood, my hometown, Rockaway Beach, Queens, New York, Osama bin Laden, you can kiss my royal Irish ass.
A defiant spirit that was summoned again today.
That's the makeup of the New York City Fire Department. That's my makeup. That's my son who was missing in the World Trade Center's makeup. That's my other son that's down the block helping the people in Queens.
Tonight, the local church here has already seen at least a dozen memorials over the last 8 weeks. Now, tonight, they are preparing for more. At least 6 people remain missing on the ground. Dan.
Lee Cowan reporting live from Belle Harbor, New York. In the war overseas, since launching their breakout offensive last Friday, U.S.-backed anti-Taliban forces have made strikingly rapid progress. The question now is whether they can hold it. Long pinned up in Afghanistan's northeast corner, United Front troops quickly captured Mazar-e-Sharif, then drove the Taliban from Herat and other key towns. Tonight, they're within sight of Kabul itself, but are being held back. As CBS's David Martin reports, Americans are there too.
Special forces on the ground in Afghanistan. They're probably American, but could be British, since both countries now have teams on the ground, calling in strikes on Taliban troops who have been forced to abandon their dug-in positions around cities and are now out in the open, more vulnerable than ever to attacks from the air. Yesterday alone, more than 400 bombs were dropped on Afghanistan. After years of stalemate, the opposition army is now taking up position on the outskirts of the capital.
We will not enter Kabul at this stage. We will stop before Kabul in a convenient front line.
Draw a line from Kabul to Herat, and the Taliban has been forced to abandon the cities north of that line, with the exception of a few pockets of resistance. In Mazar-e-Sharif, the U.S. will now be able to send in a team to inspect a fertilizer plant suspected of making chemical weapons for Osama bin Laden. The opposition advance and the Taliban collapse came faster than expected, with some units simply abandoning their equipment and running. Now the Bush administration is scrambling to take advantage of it by organizing an international force to escort shipments of food, which have been loaded on barges ready to ferry across the river that is the border between Afghanistan and Uzbekistan.
We're still waiting for security clearance to find out if the other side is secure.
The aircraft carrier Stennis left California today to relieve one of the carriers currently bombing the Taliban, a sign the U.S. can keep it up for as long as it takes. And a second Marine amphibious group has been ordered to take up station off the coast of Pakistan, a sign the U.S. can still step up the pressure.
The Taliban will try to consolidate its remaining forces in the south, where the opposition is not as strong as it is in the north. But the U.S. has begun infiltrating special forces teams into the south to provide the same kind of assistance that is working so well in the north. Dan?
David Martin reporting live from the Defense Department. What could be a successful drive to capture Kabul, the capital, is reportedly being held back because the Bush administration is not, at least not yet, prepared to have the city occupied and a whole new government installed. The worry is about a minority government not sufficiently representative of the large Pashtun population which dominates much of Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden has been quoted recently as boasting that his arsenal in Afghanistan includes nuclear weapons. U.S. officials say that they doubt this is true, but CBS News has confirmed that bin Laden has tried to obtain such weapons. Over the past 2 years, he has sought help from at least 10 Pakistani nuclear scientists. The scientists reportedly refused to join bin Laden without permission from the Pakistani government. Still ahead on this special hour-long edition of the CBS Evening News, Anti-Taliban forces are moving fast in Afghanistan, but speed cannot disguise the cruelty of war. And later, American Airlines struggled to survive yet another sudden disaster. Afghanistan by forces of the anti-Taliban United Front are a major boost for the U.S.-led war. But as CBS's Byron Pitts reports from inside Afghanistan tonight, they also underscore the brutality of battle in a land that has known no peace in more than 20 years.
Today, United Front soldiers counted their bounty after the bloodiest weekend in this war so far. In what seemed like 72 straight hours of bomb blast, attacks and counterattacks, much was gained here and much was lost. There were the rocket launchers and rifles, boots and sleeping bags taken off the bodies of Taliban soldiers killed in battle. This tank commander boasted of running over 27 wounded Taliban soldiers. Your tanks ran over them, killed them. It was easier, he said, than taking prisoners. There were prisoners and prizes. This letter taken from a dead Taliban soldier written on the stationery of a bin Laden terrorist cell.
I know that there is very strongly bombarding on you, so be strong, and God will pardon all of you.
For the first time, civilians in northern Afghanistan were allowed back into villages once controlled by the Taliban. Cross the Kacha River, they were told. It's safe to go home. But safety can be a slippery word in war. Sunday night, 6 journalists accompanied a United Front commander to a town that had just been declared safe. 3 of the 6 were gunned down, shot to death as they scrambled for safety.
Suddenly we were being fired upon from 3 sides.
Paul McGow is one of the 3 journalists who survived.
We were ambushed. And probably the nastiest thing of it all was the bodies were looted by the time we got to them this morning.
McGow admits he gained a story, but lost 3 friends.
If you combine the losses on both sides on that ridge last night, apart from the media, there were 110 people killed.
What do you take from what you lived through?
Thank God I'm alive. It was very scary. And it doesn't make me want to pack up and go home, but it makes me want to be close to someone.
Gains and losses on one weekend in one nation at war. Byron Pitts, CBS News, Kalikata, Afghanistan.
Coming up next here on the CBS Evening News, it has now lost 3 jetliners in 2 months. Can American Airlines survive? Travel today for thousands of passengers around the country, especially to and from New York airports. But the FAA did not order a national shutdown of U.S. skies as it did on September 11th. Since that day, air travel is down about 20% nationwide. And as CBS's Bob McNamara reports, today's crash only makes it harder for American and other airlines to stabilize and recover.
Just before flying to the New York crash site, American's top executive underscored the mounting misfortune.
As you would imagine, today's news comes at a difficult time for the nation, a difficult time for the airline industry, and a very difficult time for American Airlines.
After losing 2 jetliners to September's terror attacks, American had scratched and scrambled to fly through stormy financial skies. 20,000 employees were laid off as losses climbed to more than $10 million a day. Travelers had to scramble too when American slashed 500 daily routes from its flight schedule. If it was an accident that brought down a 3rd American airliner, aviation analyst Michael Boyd says the airline can survive, but an act of terror could devastate.
Well, if it's an act of terror, we're not talking about American Airlines. We can go to the yellow pages under airlines, start at A and go to Z, and they're all in very deep trouble. So it won't be just American that's in deep trouble if it's terrorism. It'll be the entire industry because nobody's going to get on an airplane in the future.
That's the low point at September 17th.
Dallas analyst David Johnson, who's seen American stock value drop more than 60%, says even if the crash proves accidental, all airlines will continue taking heavy losses.
The drain is just hard to believe. It's staggering. It's breathtaking. All of those airplanes parked on the ground, costing money every day.
Some analysts say regardless of the cause of the crash, many people will be afraid to fly. And as a result, there could be more layoffs for the airline industry in the days and weeks to come. Dan?
Bob McNamara in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. An already nervous Wall Street opened for business just minutes after the plane crash, and stock prices plunged. The Dow lost nearly 200 points in the early going, but later recovered most of that. At the close, the Dow was off 53. The NASDAQ posted a gain of 11. With the country again at war, Americans are observing Veterans Day 2001 with a heightened sense of gratitude for the men and women of the armed services. This morning, current and former military officers were honored at a special opening ceremony at the New York Stock Exchange. In Lansing, Michigan, there were dedication ceremonies yesterday for a new memorial recalling the more than 2,600 servicemen and women from Michigan who died in Vietnam. And in Galveston, Texas, 50 men whose service in World War II prevented them from finishing high school were finally awarded their diplomas. Some of our CBS stations will be returning now to local programming. But for many of you, this special expanded edition of the CBS Evening News will continue, so stay here with us.
This is CBS.